Thank you. It's a great honor to be having a conversation with such esteemed gentlemen, very, very involved in the global climate conversation. Mr. Bhattacharya, you actually were very involved in the report that was actually an important component of the discussion at Belém on, from Baku to Belém, the 1.3 trillion climate integrated financial climate funding agenda. Would you like to share with us, what happened at Belém with respect to that conversation and how are we looking to take that forward? Because that is the one most important discussion, I think, not just for this room, but for moving the climate discussion forward at all, because without private capital flowing in and without integrating the public and the private money in this respect, I don't think any solution's possible. So we are really looking forward to your feedback on what happened in this global conversation just a few days ago.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here, and especially to Shri Jain Sinha, with whom I have the privilege to work for a long time. So the COP30 discussions concluded yesterday, and I left 2 days before the conclusion, but I was there for most of it. And there were two big elements this year in the COP. One on the COP means the Global Climate Conference, and this is, notionally the COP30 is the 30th such climate finance conference, started in 1992. So at this year's COP, there were two big things. One was, this was the year where all countries were asked to submit new, kind of commitments called nationally determined contributions. So far, about 128 countries have submitted. India says, Minister Yadav said that, India will submit it in December, and the Indian submission remains very much anchored in the net zero by 2070. Nevertheless, I think it's fair to say that when all the NDCs come in, they will be still short of what the world needs in terms of not just the 1.5 degree target, but even the 2 degree target. We are still off track. So I just want to recognize that the urgency that was mentioned at the start of this meeting really still needs to be there in a very fulsome way. We are still short. Second, a strong recognition, from COP29 that finance is a very big part of this, and that finance goes way beyond the narrow kind of public finance element, as Amar mentioned. And based actually on the work of the Independent High-Level Expert Group, which I co-chair with Nick Stern and Vera Songwe, there was this 1.3 trillion figure, which is the amount of external finance we believe is needed per year by 2035 in order to meet the climate investment goals. And what COP29 did is charge the COP30 and COP29 presidents to say what might be a roadmap to achieving this 1.3 trillion. What was also very striking this time is that ministers of finance, who typically don't engage very much in the COP, actually came forward in a very, very compelling way, led by the Ministry of Finance of Brazil, and to create something called a Circle of Finance Ministers. They also came out with a report around how this might be met, focusing very much on the role of finance ministries, and we, the Independent High-Level Expert Group, provided analytical foundations for that work. So what are the big takeaways? First, external finance is only so much as the investment that it supports. And what we recognize is that we need a really big push on investment in the clean energy transition. We need a big push on investment in adaptation and resilience and coping with climate impacts, what we call loss and damage. And we need a big push on natural capital. We often think about climate as climate, but actually the relationship between climate and natural capital, as we were hearing before, is extremely important. And finally, in all of this, not so much about money, we need to think very tactically about just transitions. Because if the transitions are not just, they will not be sustainable. So our numbers show that the emerging markets and developing countries need to invest about 3.2 trillion by 2035. More than 2 trillion of that is in the clean energy transition. Renewable energy, the grid, storage, decarbonization, not only in easy areas like transport, but more difficult areas, as we heard in the hard-to-abate sectors. Second, a really, really big push on adaptation and resilience, because climate impacts are accelerating. The name of the game is resilience. And finally, natural capital. And particularly this year, because the conference took place in Brazil, an overwhelming recognition of the importance of nature and biodiversity, but also degraded land. You know, when I was in Brazil, you know, and look at the degraded land in Brazil, I used to, as an Indian, I said, actually, the degraded land in India is more than the degraded land in Brazil. So this is a huge economic opportunity, it's a sustainable opportunity, and it's a livelihood opportunity. So investment, investment, investment is the name of the game. But in order to do that, we will need finance, and there are three problems with the finance right now. A, that particularly private finance is not at the kind of scale that we need. Our numbers target about 1.3 trillion in private finance of this investment. At the moment, external private finance to emerging markets and developing countries in the climate sphere is only $40 billion. This is a very big hill to climb, very big hill to climb. And we know that that agenda requires moving on multiple levers. So let me quickly rattle them on. Imad mentioned some of them. The first is, for the private sector, you have to be able to tackle the investment climate. And in the areas that we are talking about, as we heard, there are many, many impediments that have to be overcome. And you know, all actors need to come together around the investment climate. And a big way in which we think we can do that is now country platforms. Very interestingly, in a lot of focus on country platforms in Belém, India offered to develop a country platform on adaptation and resilience. You know, that's really very important for India, but it also will be very important for the world. Second, we know we have this perennial problem of project preparation. The ecosystem of project preparation is not very well developed, and we do not have adequate project preparation facilities, and the ecosystem has a lot of gaps. And this is an area, you know, with the Global Infrastructure Facility of the World Bank and the MDBs working as a system, we could do much better. Third, everywhere a recognition that we have a shortage of catalytic equity. Catalytic equity is one of the really scarce things, and you know, Eversource is a good example of how we can mobilize that. But as you know, it's very difficult. You have to go fishing on in many ponds to try and mobilize the kind of finance you're looking for. The architecture for mobilization of catalytic equity, indeed for structured finance right now, is extremely inefficient. So tackling that, we feel, is extremely important. De-risking end-to-end. When I say end-to-end, all the way from project conception, you know, to the operating stage is required. Many different types of risks, from macro risks to, you know, to PPA risks, to liquidity risks that have to be tackled. The World Bank Group has come forward with much better structure of guarantees, but the scale of it is still too limited, and the platforms are not really effective. So we need, the World Bank lab is doing a lot of good work. This is being extended elsewhere, but we need a much, much better system of guarantees and de-risking in the private investment space. Finally, we need to be able to go to scale. And we will only be able to do that if we have securitization. Our aggregation and securitization are the only way we are going to get to scale. And at the moment, again, the MDBs have done quite a lot. IFC just came out with a very important initiative right now on an originate to share model. The Inter-American Development Bank has come forward with a proposal called Reinvest to do third-party securitization. All of this will give the kind of capital that you need in order to be able to turn around and get to the scale that is necessary. So a lot of innovation is in the air. It's still quite fragmented, a huge potential in the coming years to try and systematize this and to go to scale. In my view, a lot of that experimentation, learning, and success will happen here in India. I mean, I'm in this space all over the world. There is no place where innovation is happening right now more than here, and therefore the kind of combination of what's happening here with really getting the big, big global pools of capital into play is the answer. And that's the main message, I would say, coming out of Belém from the kind of climate finance discussions we had.
Thank you. There's a lot of follow-up questions based on that, but I must say, just from our experience on Eversource, from the Green Growth Equity Fund, we have seen firsthand how catalytic equity, a dollar that you raise can have an impact of anywhere between $10 to $100. So absolutely, the GGF, in fact, that's managed by Eversource, was a great experiment, if I might say, because it was really the government of India and the UK government, through their respective sovereign wealth funds, that first came out with the idea of setting up GGF, and they were the lead sponsors. And we've seen, and we have a report on the numbers of the impact that it has had. So you're right that that experimentation in a country like India, where when we actually set up GGF, you didn't even have the investments to make. We had to kind of literally get on the drawing board and figure out how to get those investments, and to a large extent, we had to do a lot of green investments, not in the green environment sense, but start them up by ourselves and then scale it significantly, which led us to realization you need a lot of long-term funding apart from everything else that you said. It's not your typical private equity investment or even infrastructure investment. It's something that needs to be thought about very, very differently. And blended finance is another thing I want to talk to you about. But Justice Wilson, just to bring you into the conversation, you presented at COP2, and just wanted to understand from you, from your vantage point, what the global conversation around climate's looking at. Like he talked about, 1.5 or 2 degrees even. Is it a lost cause in that regard? And are we looking at adaptation? Are we looking at transition? Is the conversation really on resilience? Where is the global conversation from your point of view, especially with the geopolitics in the world right now?
What an exciting question. I hope I can give an answer that's somewhat worthy of the question. But I have been involved in global policy from a legal point of view as a member of the Supreme Court of Hawaii and a founding member of the Global Judicial Institute in the Environment. And as a consequence, have been embedded in the question that's, I guess you could say, a truth-testing, on-the-ground question of risk. The degree to which concepts of climate solution are valid and authentic and not just ambitious, because the role of the courts is to actually determine the scientific truth of a project and then determine whether it's legal. It's pretty straightforward, but as Amar has indicated, there is a major problem afoot that naturally provides opportunities for capital, but it also is a major problem that provides risk for capital. Specifically, here's an example of what I mean. Keeping in mind that in the event that there's a commitment, say, for example, to a climate solution, oftentimes it's considered in terms of adaptation, which is much of what the focus was of the recent COP, and mitigation. When you think of mitigation, it's the idea that you reduce greenhouse gas emissions so that we meet the most important target, which Amar mentioned, 1.5 degrees, 1.5 degrees. So that gets me to your question about the reality or the chance that we have of achieving something other than a collision between the very strong regulatory power of courts, the collision between the regulatory power of courts and the aspirations of the private capital community. Two projects as an example. The biggest project proposed for development of energy and coal in Australia after enormous amounts of investment was shut down by the court because it did not comply with the law as it was being very specifically analyzed by a judge who had a science-based approach. In Hawaii, we had a massive development in Hawaii standards, about a $500 million energy project that was stopped by the courts because of the implications it had on climate. Okay, so you can see what I mean about risk. Turning to the COP, this COP gravitated in a direction that portends more collision between courts and private equity potentially, because it's moving just in large part towards adaptation, which is necessary. In Hawaii, the classic example of adaptation would be building seawalls for the coming future. But mitigation focuses on, again, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So the collision that I'm describing, which is a very real one that affects risk management, can be seen in the numbers of litigation. 20 to 30 years ago, there was no real climate litigation at a global scale. Now there are over 2,000 cases that are being filed with great consequence around the world that is challenging government policy and the policies of private entities in energy investment and energy policy. So I'll conclude by saying I do think there is movement because there's discussion. And there is an igniting globally of really responsible, as the projects here indicate, really responsible, what you could say relevant projects that will be absorbed by the judicial community in a way that is comfortable without intervention. It is happening. And a lot of that policy making does arise to some extent from the discussions, the ambitious discussions of the COP. But the COP can't really be seen, right, as a solution that is workable for the capital markets unless it's combined with, for good or for bad, the regulatory framework that comes from the courts. So if you consider what is the likelihood of investment being successful, if you're talking about green economy for transportation, the movement towards electrification is pretty straightforward. It's been tested in courts. Good investment. If you want to aspire to new forms of energy, such as using biofuels, that's a little more risky and is not necessarily being accepted by the courts. But ultimately, if you can connect capital investment to the targets that are the major targets, like 1.5 degrees, the likelihood of courts accepting it is realistic because, again, the courts are not there for policy development. It has to do with authenticity, the truth, the scientific truth of whether a project is going to add or detract from these legally required goals, like 1.5 degrees is difficult to achieve. It will stand in the way of many energy projects potentially until you change that framework, which arose from the Paris Agreement. And as I have seen, and in our discussions in the COP just a few weeks ago, is still accepted. When you look at 1.5 degrees, that is a significantly important, for Hawaii, it's unconstitutional to propose a project that's based on global warming to 2 degrees. You can't have a project like that. Whether that will be true in India is going, I'll conclude by saying whether that would be true in India will in some ways decide the fate not just of long-term capital investment and whether the $1.3 trillion a year that's going to be invested is invested purely in adaptation and abandons mitigation, or would the 1.3 or 1.5 trillion be invested in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and not just the consequences? Because the Supreme Court of India is the most important court in the world on climate policy. It issued a decision about a year ago that recognized 1.5 degrees, which is an extremely important proposition, for example, as I said, for Hawaii, as a truth testing of environmental justice and what's required under the Constitution of India that provides for, under its right to life provision, the right to a life-sustaining climate. And in that particular case, there was a project at issue about whether to bury electrical lines, a very complicated and a very expensive process, and the court intervened in that sense. Well, if you throw it into 2 degrees, the COP process is going to be a lot different. Or you moved, we're headed now 3 degrees during our lifetime. Your projects are likely to be much different, of course. So again, being able to analyze risk in terms of the legal requirements of 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, or 3 degrees is important, but in the country of India, you're still with this very important 1.5 degree overall goal. So I would say that there is a chance we'll have a coming together of not just the justice that's so-called required under the constitutions, but also the justice that's in the mind of capital investors. And the more that there is that collaboration in terms of an ultimate goal, the better. And maybe we'll have finally a global climate protection plan. That'd be interesting to see what does the plan look like that says we're going to get to 1.5 degrees. Where do the reductions come from? So thank you for the question. Hope that's a slightly helpful answer.
Absolutely, and we've had conversations about you raising, in the process of raising $1 billion fund for integrated climate finance agenda. So, that from what Mr. Bhattacharya said is still a drop in the ocean, but if it can be for equity investments, huge catalytic effect that it can have. You talked about, the roadmap, and that's for developing countries that need the $1.35 trillion, and I think to achieve by 2035. What is the advice that's coming out for India if India is really, going to be one of the leaders in the area and needs to be? What is your advice coming out of the report for India to be that leader? What does it need to do in terms of policy differences that it needs to make, and general outlook that the Indian government needs to have, and the South engagement, the global engagement India needs to have to achieve that?
I think, as I said, most of the investment we are looking at is private investment now. It's very different than 15 years ago in this space when we were thinking about big public infrastructure. Now most of it is private investment. And therefore, the most important thing is really strategic direction and clarity. If the private sector is going to invest at the scale we want them to invest, they do need a roadmap. They do need a signal that this is the future, whether the future is with regard to renewables, whether it's regard to electric mobility, with storage or whatever else, and they need that. Second, they need, of course, to be able to tackle the policy impediments. There was a very interesting piece, which recorded the number of permits that are necessary for a clean energy project here in India, and it's astounding. So we have to be able to tackle, in some sense, those impediments that, in some sense, raise the costs of doing business. Third, while this is mostly private, we will need complementary public investments. The grid is the most important one. Jansana spoke about that. We will need a massive upgrading of the grid if we're going to absorb all those renewables that we are thinking of. And we've done analysis here in India of how much that will take. And, NTPC has done that assessment as well. It's very, very large investments that will be needed. You have to be able to tackle some of the impediments around finance, and particularly in the PE/VC space. At the moment, in India, there are lots of regulatory impediments that impede, in some sense, structured finance of the kind that Eversource has done. So we are pushing very hard, including with the upcoming budget, that maybe these impediments could be tackled so we can get blended finance at scale. And the international architecture needs to improve so that when a fund like Eversource goes out looking for catalytic equity, it doesn't have to have as much kind of work to be done in attracting that. When you have a proven track record, it should be easier to scale up, not more difficult to scale up. So I do think that India is the place where a lot of the experimentation can happen in the real sector, first and foremost, of the kind we heard, because those are the real opportunities. But the role of the PE/VC sector is connecting finance with those real sector opportunities. So I really feel that this is the place where, in some sense, we make finance happen. Of course, it is backed by, formal finance in terms of banks and, capital markets and all that. But the advantage of the kind of finance we are discussing here is it's nimble, it's flexible, and it's connective tissue. So I do hope that, India will show the way, but there's a lot of interest in this across the world at this moment in time, and so it has to be a two-way street. Learnings here informing what is necessary from international finance. And I do want to emphasize that particularly for India, the role of development finance institutions will be critical. I'm coming from Brazil. There's a huge development finance ecosystem there through their large development finance institution called Benedez. We don't have that in India. We have a much more diffuse structure. In a way that's okay, but it makes it a bit more challenging.
Yeah, I think the task for IVCA really is, we need to work with the government to create this infrastructure of policies, finance, and integrating that to be able to, meet this funding gap of 40 billion, did you say, to 1.35 trillion. So on that note, I've been told time's been up for a while, so I will wrap up the discussion, but really looking forward to reading the report, and thank you for your time, and thank you, Justice Wilson, for your inputs and joining us. Thank you, everybody.